They used this, during World War II. And,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for
Okay.
different stuff. And then actually the Fish and Wildlife people use it a lot now for their surveys and things like that. So this is where the original White Bluffs Ferry would have been located. The ferry was established in 1861 by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Howe. White Bluffs itself was also established in 1861, again in large part because of the traffic coming up the river. This was where they had to unload the boats. The original location of White Bluffs, though, was on the other side of the river, sort of across from that H reactor that I mentioned earlier. In 1894, though, there was a large flood that flooded out much of the town, and they moved over here to this location, primarily because it was a little higher up. And so the second location of White Bluffs was located right where we're standing, and it was formally established in 1907. Now, you can see some pictures of what it looked like here. The second ferry to be established was established by George Borden in probably the late 1880s, early 1890s. And it was a horse-powered ferry. This is Pete, and this is Ginger. They walked around all day long. In the center of the ferry was a capstan attached to a cable. And so as they walked around in circles, it wrapped that cable around a gear, and it would pull them across to the other side. When they got to the other side, to come back here, they reversed the horses, and they walked in the opposite direction. This ferry was operated by George Borden. George also worked for Henry Gable. Remember Henry Gable? George helped Henry with his horses. George began operating the ferry, like I say, in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And he operated it for a number of years before he finally decided to take a vacation. He'd never taken a vacation. And he and his wife still actually lived on the east side. So he found somebody to take over the ferry operations for him while he was gone. They packed up the kids and the family and the horses and the wagon, got on the ferry to come across. They were going to go to Yakima to visit relatives. About halfway across, the sweep in the front of the ferry that helps steer it snapped off and knocked George into the water. George had big heavy boots on at the time, and he sunk like a rock. It turns out that the ferryman didn't know how to swim. He'd been operating the ferry for years and couldn't swim. His wife tried to save him, but she wasn't able to. It turns out that George also had a pair of 6-guns that he really liked. These were big, heavy 6-guns that he always tucked in the small of his back. And everybody suspects that's probably where those were that day, and that did not help George at all. So unfortunately, George died, and the gentleman, Fred Rollins, who took over the ferry, retired Pete and Ginger and replaced them with a steam-powered ferry. And Fred graciously married George's widow.
I was going to ask.
That was a nice end to the story. Now, I mentioned the White Bluffs Yakima Road here. Prior to that, this was largely crisscrossed with Indian trails. There was a very popular Native American fishing camp just upriver, and like I say, just a lot of small trails. There was a brief war with the Native Americans here. It was called the Yakima War. It ran from 1855 to 1858. During that time, the cavalry established a remount station on the other side of the river. I don't know if you can see, but there's a cabin across the river there, that dark structure. That was not present then, but that's the location of the remount station. The cavalry was situated here primarily to protect the miners from the Native Americans. After the war, a gentleman by the name of Mullen was commissioned to build a road from Fort Benton, Montana, down to Fort Walla Walla. It's about 600 plus miles. It was a huge undertaking. But when that road was built, a spur was built off of it from Spokane down here to White Bluffs called the Frazier Trail. And it was a very major route for transportation, coming right here to the White Bluffs ferry landing. Again, contributing to the traffic here and the success of White Bluffs. Now, early in the 1900s, probably 1905 or so, railroad traffic began to compete with the river traffic for stuff that was being carried. So the steamships were having a price war with the railroad, and the railroad was winning. And revenue here in White Bluffs was beginning to dry up a little bit, and people were really concerned about their livelihood and the fate of White Bluffs. 1910, 1912, though, that's when the Chicago-Milwaukee St. Paul Railroad began talking about bringing a spur line down from Beverly. And they said they were going to come down to White Bluffs and on down to Hanford. Except things didn't work out quite the way they planned. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our next stop. The rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say.
How many people lived here in White Bluffs?
So when the government came in 1943, there were about 500 people living
500?
in and around the town. Not
Yeah.
all right here in the town, but some of those farms that
and
we
stuff,
saw.
right?
So yeah,
Wow, they had school, post office?
they had a school, post office, a number of churches, hotels.
Wow.
Again, so you can look at some of these pictures. You know, there's a hotel here, and
Wow.
this is kind of a nice picture showing. You know, here's the White Bluffs landing. There's the ferry landing right
Wow.
here. This area is going to become known as Old Town, and that will become clearer when we get out to where the railroad station was located. So.
You know, you periodically mention the 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
I take it the Civil War didn't have much impact.
No, it did not. In fact, I'm not sure how much news of it reached here. I suspect there was some, but it was
They didn't
probably
even
not.
know.
I'm sure they knew. I'm sure that it was not timely information, but they were not directly affected by the Civil War at all.
So it was prosperous here until 1943, huh?
It was.
Yeah.
It was. It was. Compared to Richland, and we'll talk a little bit more about Richland on our way back. Richland was quite small, and people speculate that this area would have become the center of commerce, not the Tri-Cities, if
Yeah.
the government had not come in.
Yeah.
So,
Huh.
yeah.
But you can't get boats up through here though, huh? Because it's too shallow?
Small boats can.
Yeah.
But like the
Ships.
American Empress and cruise ships and things like that can't
Or
come
anything
up
to haul their goods
barges.
down?
Right.
They couldn't ship
They
anything?
couldn't get any further up. They could go down, and it's
Oh, but they couldn't get to here?
Yes.
From here down?
yes.
Oh.
Here down was fine. This is a little misleading because when these people settled here, there were no dams on the river.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is a little different
Yeah.
flow because of the dams
Yeah.
further up, but not too much.
Yeah.
This still is a good location. You know, if you needed to cross the river, this was a good spot.
What's that triangle over there?
That's a marker for eagle nesting. There's areas that they control access to during certain times of the year.
Oh, down on top of the pole.
Yep.
Where?
Yeah. That
See the
that
sign?
wooden pole right there with the.
pole right behind it, go up to the top.
Ah,
Cool.
there you go. There's actually you can see the osprey nest, and beyond the osprey nest where the metal tower is, those trees often have white herons nesting in it. So it's a very popular bird spot.
Imagine they're undisturbed down here.
Yeah, relatively so.
So the closest big town from here would be either Portland or Seattle then, huh? When they lived here,
Yeah.
probably?
Yeah, depending on how much you mean by big. I think Spokane is pretty good size.
Oh,
Not as
Spokane.
big as Portland.
Spokane. Okay.
Yeah.
It's funny how you can have a civilization and then all of a sudden it's just non-existent.